So today's daf, continuing, we're actually in the middle of something in Masechet Shavuot, Chaf Dalid. So the discussion today and discussion yesterday was based on our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah said that if a person makes a shvu'ah that they won't eat, and then they eat foods that are not edible or drink things that are not drinkable, they are not chayav, because that's not eating. But if they make a shvuah they won't eat, and they eat things that are not kosher to eat, because they're treifa or nevela or shkatzim, rimashim, then they are chayav, right? According to the Tanakama, Rabbi Shimon said you're patur. So we asked in the Gemara, what's the difference? You said you're not going to eat. These are not edible. So we said, well, it's referring to a case where you specified. You said, I will not eat tray food, meaning if you just said not eat, we assume you mean you won't eat food that you normally eat. But you specified and said, I will not eat even a McDonald's hamburger, in which case, if you do eat it, you're chayav. But the Gemara asked yesterday, and we had this several times already, how could your shvua be chal on a davar that is asur min haTorah, right? How could your shvua have an effect on something which is already prohibited from the Torah? And so the Gemara's answer yesterday was two answers. One answer came from Rabbi Yochanan and Rav and Shmuel, and they said it's where you were kolel. You specified dvarim hamutarim in dvarim ha'asurim. So you said, I will not eat any meat, including kosher meat and non-kosher meat. And then because the shvua is chal on kosher meat, it's also chal on the non-kosher meat. Okay, Rish Lakish had a different answer. Rish Lakish said it's talking about where you were mifaresh, right? Where you basically said, I'm going to eat half a shear. So as Charlie asked yesterday, right? There are those who hold that chatzi shear is asur min Torah. I looked into this, and clearly this has to disagree with that. Rish Lakish has to hold that's not the case. The chatzi shear might be asur midrabanan, but it's not asur min Torah. But you can add an isur for yourself on even a chatzi shear.
If I remember the discussion, Reish Lakish did hold that way, and Rabbi Yochanan was the one who said Hatzi Shimin Asr Min HaTorah. But
Okay.
it's been a while since I looked at that. So that'd be consistent.
Me too. So yesterday we asked, why does each person disagree with the other person? So we said that Rabbi Yochanan, Rav and Shmuel disagreed with Reish Lakish because he requires you to be either according to Rabbi Akiva or the Chachamim, either specify a small amount or not. And that's not Divrei HaKol. They want to go according to everybody. Why doesn't Reish Lakish like the answer of Rabbi Yochanan and Rav and Shmuel that it's a Isser Kolel? And Reish Lakish said yesterday an interesting concept, which we'll read at the bottom today. Last line on Chaf Gimel Amud Bet. Amar lecha, right? Well, the question. Let's do second to last line. Ela Reish Lakish my time along my Rabbi Yochanan. Amar lecha, because Reish Lakish will say to you, Ki aminan Isser Kolel. When we say Isur Kolel, that a new Isur can include prohibited things because it has additions, that is the Isur Haba Me'elav. That's where the Isur comes on its own, and the example is Yom Kippur, right? You're not allowed to eat a piece of, say, chalev, right? Yom Kippur comes, you're not allowed to eat anything on Yom Kippur, including kosher meat and non-kosher meat. So Yom Kippur falls on everything. But Isser haba atzma lo amrinan. If you're making up the Isser, right, like a shvua, where you basically say, I include X and Y, there you can't include Y, basically. Even though you say it in the same sentence, you're basically arbitrarily adding a second thing. And you can't add a second thing that is already prohibited from the Torah. It only works when it's done, quote unquote, naturally, or habam me'elav. So that was what we said yesterday. Now, today, that's where we finished yesterday. The second line of Daf Chaf Daled Amud Aleph, you're awake? Just barely. Bishlam el Reish Lakish. Now, remember, there's a second opinion in our Mishnah of Rabbi Shimon. The Tanakama said that if you make a shvu'ah that you're not going to eat anything, and you eat nivelot and treifot, you're chayav. Right now, we explained according to some opinions, it's where you're mefarish. I specifically make a shvua. I'm not going to eat nevelot and treifot. Maybe according to Rabbi Yochanan, you were kolel. I'm not going to eat any meat, including nevelot and treifot. And Rabbi Shimon then comes and says, I disagree. You're patur. So now, why is Rabbi Shimon disagree? So Bishlama, the Reish Lakish, according to Reish Lakish, I understand. Mishum hachi kapata Rabbi Shimon. I understand why Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Titania, because Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol shehu lemakot, any amount that you do wrong is enough to mechayev you in makot. V'lo amru kazayet el lekarban. The the Chachamim only require you to have a kazayet for a karban. But in general, when the Torah says don't eat treif, it means even a little bit. In which case, You can't make a shvua to prohibit yourself on something treif, because what are you going to say? I made a shvua to include even a small piece. A small piece is already prohibited. So if Rabbi Shimon is consistent with himself, right, he says that any amount is usur for any prohibition in the Torah, in which case you can't make a shvua because it already has a prohibition from Har Sinai. So that makes a lot of sense. El Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, where the reason for the Tanakama is Isser Kolel, what does Rabbi Shimon argue about Isser Kolel? My time, Rabbi Shimon did Patar, right? Right? Why would Rabbi Shimon say you're Patar? Says, well, that's also very consistent because Midi Hutaima El Mishon Isser Kolel. The whole reason you're chayiv is because of Isser Kolel. Rabbi Shimon the Tamei the Let La Isser Kolel. We have another source we're about to quote in a second of Rabbi Shimon who says, I don't agree with this whole concept of Isser Kolel. So that's beautiful. If Rabbi Shimon does not agree that you can add isurim to something because that's already usher to you, but you can add more isurim by the concept of kolel, that because you included more things in the new prohibition, it includes the old one as well, or the old food as well, the old thing as well. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with that whole concept. Where did we see that? The time. Now we get to a Braita, which is really in Kritut, but obviously is quoted in many other places. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon himself said, and this is why we're quoting Rabbi Shimon, Ha'ochel nevela b'yom HaKippur. Person eats nevela. Remember, nevela is an animal that was not shechted properly, right? Let's call it McDonald's for our purposes, right? You eat nevela on Yom Kippur. Where are we? Patur. Okay. According to Rabbi Shimon, you are patur. Now, you're not patur, obviously, because it's Yom Kippur, but you're patur from the Isser of nevela. Right, and the reason, sorry, you're patur from the Isser of Yom Kippur, not nevela, right? The reason you're patur from bringing a karban for doing a shogeg on Yom Kippur is because the nevela was already prohibited before Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur came; it doesn't add a separate prohibition. And since Yom Kippur doesn't add a separate prohibition, it's like eating any nevela. Remember, you don't bring a karban chatat on eating nevela; you only bring a karban chatat on Yom Kippur, right? And since it was already prohibited from nevela, and now Yom Kippur was added, Rabbi Shimon says, I disagree. There's no addition. It was already prohibited. There's no Isser of Yom Kippur on this piece of meat. There's only an Isser, a pre-existing Isser of Nevela. So, okay, so that is why Rabbi Shimon disagrees in our Mishnah. So it actually turns out that our Mishnah works out really nicely, both according to Rabbi Yochanan, that it's Isser Kolel, and Rish Lakish, that is a specific shear. Now, says the Gemara, we're about to introduce over the next daf, today's daf, several details of Shvuah that the Mishnah has not yet taught us. So one of the fundamental issues of Shavuah is that there's a principle that we're going to quote a lot later, that the Torah says if you make a Shvuah, Shvuat Bitoy, Lahara or Lahitev, which means to do bad or to do good. And we interpret that to mean bad is like I won't eat or I won't take a shower. And good is I will eat or I will take a shower, right? Or I will do something healthy. But in general, there's the machloket later about whether a shvuah has to work in both contexts for it to be a shvuah. Meaning, do you have to have what's called lav and hain, where I make a shvuah, I'm going to eat. I could make a shvuah, I won't eat. And therefore, the shvuah that I will eat is chal. But what if you can't make the negative, the contrast shvuah? And here's a great example, because let's say you make a shvuah that you're going to not eat nevela, right? So we had a machloket. Does that affect your nevela? You're already not allowed to eat. Can you add on a second isser? But you couldn't make the opposite shvuah. You couldn't say, I make a shvuah, I will eat nevela, because you can't take a shvuah against the Torah. So now, according to, I'm telling you it all outside because we're tired. But according to Reish Lakish, it makes a little bit more sense because Reish Lakish's shvuah in the Mishnah was a shvuah that I will eat, that I won't eat half a shear of nevela. Now, maybe you can make a shvuah that I will eat a small amount of nevela, because if a small amount of nevela is not asur min haTorah, you can make a shvuah that you'll eat that, right? I'll eat a spoonful of McDonald's. But according to the Chachamim, and Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, Rabbi Yochanan and Rav and Shmuel, the Mishnah is saying a shvuah that I won't eat nevela with kosher food, right? So you're being kolel. How could you make the opposite shvuah? I will eat meat that includes kosher food and McDonald's. You can't make that; it won't work, right? So it says, let's read that in the Gemara now. Bishlam al Reish Lakish. According to Reish Lakish, that the explanation of our Mishnah is that you made a shvuah not to eat a small amount of nevela. Mishkachat la b'lavehin. You can have the negative and the positive, meaning the won't and will for this shvuah, because you can make a shvuah, I will eat a tiny bit of nevela. Ela Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, I don't understand anything in our Mishnah. Bishma lav mishkachet la. You can say, I won't eat nevela and kosher meat. Ela hein hechi mishkachet la. How can you ever say, I will eat nevela with kosher food? Ella says, Gemara, you're right. It's Kidder Rava. The Amar Rava, because Rava is, it has to be according to the opinion of Rava. Rava is of the opinion, again, we're going to get to this later. If you say Shvu'ah shelo ochel v'achal afar patur. As Rava said, you really don't need to have both parts. And as Rava said later, if you make a shvu'ah, sorry, he said it earlier, but we're going to quote it again later. If you say a shvu'ah that you're not going to eat and you eat dirt, you're patur, right? And why are you patur? Because you're patur because your shvu'ah can't be chal because you didn't eat anything. And so basically, the way we're explaining the Mishnah now is that the only thing that paters you is if it's not a foodstuff, basically, right? And so it's not a foodstuff. Rashi changes the gersa a little bit, but anyways, that he takes out the word mishkachat, but it's like Rava. Rava said the shvuah shelo ochel, and you eat dirt, you're pater, but you're only pater for dirt. You're not pater from eating non-kosher foods because it is eating. It's not dirt. Okay. Amar of Mari, no, says Rav Mari, I actually think our mission is pretty clear that eating something that's not kosher is considered to be eating. Because Afananami Tanina, our mission makes that very clear. The end part of our mission, the last words in our mission were, Konem ishtin hanetli. I make a konem that my wife can get no hana from me. She can't sleep with me. She can't be with me. Im achalti hayom. If I ate today, right? And it turned out that on your way home from work, you went to McDonald's. You ate things that were not kosher food, but were non-kosher food. Says the Mishnah, Hari ishto asrulo. His wife is asur. So clearly you see from there that it's considered to be eating if you eat something that's not kosher, right? Because in your mind, that you meant it as eating. You said, I will prohibit my wife if I ate not kosher. We say your wife is prohibited. So you see from there that eating, even non-kosher things, is called eating. Says, well, that's not a proof at all. Because hold on a second, which is really what hachiyashta means, right? Hold on here. Hatam, there in the last case in the Mishnah, kivan de me'ikara achal. First you ate it, right? It's a past tense. You went home, you're on your way home and you ate McDonald's. You come home, your wife is screaming at you and saying, how come you're not hungry for dinner? And you say, I swear, I'll be prohibited to you if I ate anything today. There, you ate something. So because you ate it first, and hadar ishtabale, and then you made the shvuah, it's clear that you consider that to be eating. You turn the page to Chavdal and Bet. You valued that as eating, and it's included in your shvuah. Elahacha, but in our Mishnah, in the earlier case in the Mishnah, where you say, I will not eat, it's not a proof that you were thinking at that time, I won't eat shreif. Maybe you only thought I won't eat kosher. There's no proof that you thought to include non-kosher food in your shvuah. Okay, so that is, it's not a proof. It still indicates that, but it's not a proof. Now, Amar Rava. Now comes along Rava, the second line, and says, let me go back to something we were just talking about before, right? We said that the Isser Kolel is something that explains, meaning you have a prohibition not to eat nevela, but you come along and make a shvuah. If you say a shvuah, I won't eat nevela, it doesn't have any impact. It's already prohibited. But if you make a shvuah that I won't eat any meat, including kosher and non-kosher meat, or I won't eat any food or whatever, it is chal. That was the Rabbi Yochanan's explanation for the Tanakama of our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon came along and said, I disagree. Asked Rava, what's the reason that someone would disagree? My time a demand itlay isar kolel. No, the opposite. What's the reason for the chachamim, right? Why do they say that there is an isar kolel? Because midi dahavia isar mosif. It is very similar to an isar mosif. Now, remember, the isar of kolel, I don't think I talked about this yesterday yet. The isar of kolel means you include more prohibitions on the same thing, right? Or on the same object. So basically, you have one object that a man is not allowed to eat, okay? Or a woman's not allowed to eat. And it's prohibited for reason X. You come along and say, that person, I will not eat foods that include this food and other foods. So we're saying that that same food is prohibited for another reason. Now, you didn't change anything about that food. You just added other foods to your prohibition. That's called an Isser Kolel, where this food or this prohibition was included with other prohibitions. An Isser Mosif is another category which everyone agrees with, where you added prohibitions to that same thing. And the classic example, there are many classic examples, but one is say notar, right? Let's say you bring a korban. A korban is not permitted to be eaten by a Yisrael. So if you're a zar, you cannot eat a korban, but a Kohen's allowed to eat the korban, right? That animal, that piece of meat, is left overnight. It now becomes an Isser of notar. Now the Kohen can't eat that piece of meat, right? So that's called another Isur added to the piece of meat. And we understand that the same way that the Isur of notar means the Kohen can't eat the piece of meat, the Isur notar applies to Yisrael. So if a Yisrael eats this piece of meat, there are now over two prohibitions, one for a korban and one for notar, right? And the reason is that everyone agrees with that, is that because the Isser of notar added something to the meat itself, because the Kohen now can't eat it, it also added something for the Yisrael, right? So the one who holds Isser Kolel says it's very similar. By adding prohibitions, in that case of Kolel, you added more foods that you can't eat. This food becomes Asr also. It's similar to Isser Mosif, and that's why it's effective, right? That's the third line. Manda Patar, now the one who disagrees with that, which we said is Rabbi Shimon, he holds the letle, he says, Ki Amar Isser Mosif. The only time you say Isser Mosif, that's B'chad Chaticha. That's where basically the added prohibition is in the same piece of meat, right? But b'shtei chatichot lo amrinan. You don't say it when it's two different pieces of meat, meaning where a person came along and said, I won't eat kosher and non-kosher meat. Well, the new prohibition is in the kosher meat. How could you add it to the non-kosher meat? So that's why he disagrees. Amar Rava. Now, furthermore, Rava said,
I have a thought about that. So I
sure,
have a piece of Nuvela. I'm not permitted to eat it, but I could sell it or I could feed it to my animals. And then I could take a Shevuot and not get benefit from it. At that point, I can't feed it to my animals or sell it anymore.
that is correct. So we will discuss that. That is a very good example of
Oh,
where
okay.
of an not today, but we will. That is a great example of essentially an Isser Mosif through the
Yeah.
back door, basically.
Okay. Thanks.
But that is correct. But here, our mission is not where that case is, where you said you won't eat it, so you didn't add an Isser Hana. Amar Rava, now says Rava, 5 lines from the top. Leman delit let itle Isser Kolel. Let's say you go with the sort of Tanakam in our mission, and you agree that there is an Isser Kolel. Amar, if a person says, Shvua shlo ochel te'inim. Okay, a person walks in and says, I had enough pertaining dates. I had enough pertaining dates, figs. I had enough figs, right? Tainim are figs. I'm never eating any more figs, or not for a month, let's say. And then he said, are tainim figs? Okay. The Chazar v'omer, and then later in the day, he says, you know what? I actually decided, shvuah shlo ochel te'inim v'anavim. I'm not eating figs or grapes, right? Anavim are grapes. Says the Rava, migo dechayal anavim. Since your new shvua is going to be chal on the grapes, because you never prohibited yourself to grapes, chayal nami te'inim. It'll be a second shvua on your te'inim. Says Gemara Pshita. That's exactly what we've been talking about the whole time. What's the chiddush of Rava? Says the Gemara, no. I might have thought, like Reish Lakish argued earlier today, that Isser haba me'elav amrinan, right? That you only apply this concept if it's an Isser that comes on its own, meaning it's created naturally. But Isser haba ba'atzmo lo amrinan k'mashmalan. You might think that I can't artificially get up there and say, I prohibit myself now on grapes and dates. I prohibit myself on, olives, grapes, and dates. You can go on all day. You might have thought that that's not effective. Kamashmalan, that according to the Tanakama and Rabbi Yochanan and Rav and Shmuel's interpretation, that in fact is a valid Isur Kolel. Mativ Rava Bred Rabba. So now that we have established these kind of principles of Isur Kolel and Isur Mosif, asked Rava, son of Rabba, the following question. We have a Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says in Kritut, Yesh ochel achila achat v'chayev aleh arba chatat chatot v'asham echad. A person can eat one piece of meat, right? One breakfast, and Michayev 4 karban chatat. Of course, it means he did it by mistake, right? And 1 asham. Okay, now we're going to get to this asham, of course, which is going to add a little bit of spice to this Mishnah. But 4 chataot. What's the case? Elohein. The case could be a person is tameh, right? And he forgets. Remember, this has to be b'shogeg. He's tameh, and he's achal chelev. He eats a portion that's kodesh, that is chelev. Remember, the chelev are the fats of the animal that are prohibited to eat. You're chayav a karban chatat for that. V'hu notar, it happens to be leftover, so it's notar. Mina muktashin, it was from hektish, right? And it's on Yom Kippur. Okay, so there's all these prohibitions. You're not allowed to eat hektish. You're not allowed to eat a carbon. You can't eat chalev ever. Now remember, chalev is prohibited to a person basically from birth, right? The animal became hektish when a carbon. When the animal became a carbon, you added on isurim on the animal that not only can't you eat the that's a kolel. Not only can you not eat the chalev, you can't eat any part of the animal, right? But the kohen can still eat it. Then it became an Isser of Notar, so it was prohibited to the Kohen. And then there's a fourth Isser of Yom Kippur, which happened to be Yom Kippur prohibits you from eating anything. It also prohibits you from eating this thing. Now, those are four Chataot.
So I don't understand how no tar would matter for something that never was allowed to be eaten.
No. Well, you would burn it on the Mizbeach. It would be eaten by the Mizbeach, basically.
Oh, it wasn't? Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
But then you can't do that after Notar.
Got it.
But so there's four prohibitions: Notar, Chalev, Karban, basically, if you're Yisrael, assuming, and Yom Kippur. Now the fifth one, which is the Asham, is the fact that you're Tameh. Remember, if you're Tameh and you eat Kadshim, or you remember that was our Mishnah, right? You have to make a Karban Asham for that, right? Or a Levi or eight if it's B'shogeg. Anyway, so you bring the extra Karban. So there are four Chataot and one Asham. Okay. Now, Rabbi Meir says in the Mishnah in Kritut, im af where am I? Af im hayta Shabbat v'otziu chayav. Let's say it was Shabbat, and you're walking outside as you carry it out to eat it. You're also chayav for carrying on Shabbat. And said the Chachamim said that might be true, but that's irrelevant. It's not the same act of eating. Amrulo eno min Hashem. That's not the same detail. It might be true, but like we're focusing on just eating, right? And the eating is four chataot and one asham.
And you can't take kudshim out of the Beit HaMikdash anyway.
That's true, but I guess you can move from one rishut to another rishut potentially. But even if yeah, it's true. But if you take it out, it doesn't lose its status, right?
Right, yeah.
Now, ask the Gemara, and this is really, Charlie, you asked this yesterday, what our mission is about to ask, which is what about Shevuot, right? Why don't you add a fifth case by saying, I made a Shevuot? If you're correct that you can have an Isser Kolel, why don't you have a fifth chatat in the Mishnah? Mishkachet lachamesh, not a fifth chatat, but a fifth karban. Find a fifth karban, kigon she'amar, shvua shelo ochel tamarim v'chelev, right? You made a shvua for the next month, I'm not eating any dates or fats that are prohibited from an animal. And migo, chayil atmarim, chayil nami achelev. According to the Rabbanan, if it's an Isser Kolel, then you have a new prohibition. Now, when you eat this piece of chalev, that's notar, it's tameh, that's on Yom Kippur, right? You're chayav 5. Says the Gemara, you're right. But that itself is not the same set of the Mishnah. It could be true. But Kikatani, when the Mishnah said eating one thing and being over many prohibitions, those were Isur Haba Me'elav. It was talked about inherent Isurim, not man-made Isurim. Isur Haba Me'atzmo Lo Katani. That's more 1 second. You said it's a carbon. Animals are not born as a carbon, right? Hey, hektish, right? You said it's an animal, it's hektish. How could it be hektish if you didn't make it hektish? It must be you made it hektish. So once you made it hektish, you can make it a shvua. Like, no. It's talking about a hektish that was born hektish. What's the example of born hektish? A bichar. It's talking about a case where the animal was born hektish because it was born as a firstborn. The kedushato mirechem. Beautiful answer. Or Ibaidem, another explanation is why don't we include the Isser Shvu'ah in this Mishnah? As Kikatani midi delet le she'ilah. We wanted to talk about prohibitions that are absolute. But remember that a Shvu'ah has a very important trapdoor, right? If you make a Shvu'ah and then you go to a Chacham and say, I had a big misconception. I thought that I didn't need to eat, wheat because wheat was only in pancakes. Now I know wheat is in everything and I can't eat any foods anymore. You can get out of your Shvu'ah, right? So Shvu'ah is not an absolute. Midi delet le she'ilah. Mitzvot are prohibitions that can't be asked about, meaning you can't get a permission. But Shvu'ah, the itle she'ilah, lo katani. But Shvu'ah, which you can have she'ilah, because you can, if you have a good excuse, you can go to Chacham, you can get out of your Shvu'ah. So that's not an absolute. So although it's true, it doesn't fit the set. Just come on 1 second. Remember that hektish is also something that you can go and ask a she'ilah about. Hare hektish, right? What about hektish? If you say, I want my animal to be hektish, and then you can go and you make a credible explanation why you were mistaken when you made that neder, basically, you can get out of it. Well, we already explained that because we already said it's not talking about where you made it hektish. It's talking about a bechor. Ukminam bibechor. We already said it's talking about a bechor. You can't say chacham. This wasn't the firstborn. It was the firstborn, right? So it will be hektish no matter what. Now, another explanation is kikatani karban kavua. That the reason the Mishnah was talking about these 4 chataot and 1 asham, it didn't add a 5th karban or 6th karban for a shvua, is because remember, if you make a shvua that you're not going to eat something, and then you forget that shvua, and you go ahead and you bring and you do the act, you bring a karban olevi yored. So we didn't want to mention kikatani karban kavua. We're only mentioning the karbanot that are fixed, meaning they're set, no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are. But karban olevi yored lo katani. We didn't want to include a karban olevi yored because those are different kinds of karbanot. Says Gemara, but 1 second. The asham that we talked about here is a karban olevi yored. Because if you're tamei and you eat kachim, you're chayav a karban olevi yored. So how can you say we don't want a karban olevi yored? We have one. Harei tamei shachal takodesh, the karban olevi yoredu. That case in the Mishnah was a karban olevi yored. Answers the Mishnah, what Nava was about to say, it's referring to the nasi. It's referring to the president. If the president eats kachim, the tuma, you don't bring a karban olevi yored, shockingly. And it's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Eliezer, right? So you were about to say. The Amar, Rabbi Eliezer says that a nasi mevi seir, that a nasi who eats food that is a nasi who's tamei, who eats a karban, does not bring a karban olevi yored like every other Jewish person. He brings a fixed karban, which is a seir. This is a whole debate that we have in Masechet Horayot. We're going to talk about this. That the issue of karban olevi yored, according to Rabbi, what's his name? Rabbi Shimon, I think. Where am I? Rabbi Eliezer, thank you, is only by people who bring a regular karban chatat. But if you recall, a nasi that sins brings a special karban chatat, a sa'ir, as opposed to a si'ira, right? And when a nasi sins, there's an opinion, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, that by a tumah of hektish, if he is tamei and eats kodesh, he doesn't bring a karban olevi yored, he brings a fixed karban. Now, as someone pointed out on the side of my Gemara, probably me, that does not apply, as we're going to see in olevi yored, in Horayot, it does not apply to shvuah. So if you make a shvuah, a nasi does bring an olevi yored. If he's tamei, he doesn't bring an olevi yored. And so therefore, we said the case of tumah, but we didn't say the case of shvuah, even though it may apply. So that is a 3rd or 4th answer. I don't remember which one we're up to. Rav Ashi says, I have another answer, 5 lines from the bottom. The reason the Mishnah in Kritut didn't mention another prohibition of eating this piece of meat because you made a shvuah is because shvuah is very different than all other prohibitions. Why? Because kikatani midi dechayla kashir. We only talked about things that require a shear, like Shabbat and Yom Kippur and Chelev and all these things. But remember, shvuah, dechayla apachot mikashir. Everybody agrees that a shvuah cannot be effective on even less than a kazayit, right? If you say it explicitly according to the Chachamim or stam according to Rabbi Akiva, if you say I make a shvuah that I won't eat even a grain of rice, then that is effective on a grain of rice, right? So therefore, shvuah is a different kind of isur, and it's not included. So things that are chayla pachot mikashir lo katani. Says Gemara, 1 second. What about hektish? You don't need a shear for hektish. Says Gemara, yes, you do. You need babin and shavar pruta. So although you don't need a shear of a kazayit, you need a shavar pruta, right? And you need a minimum shear. By neder and by shvuah, there is no minimum shear if you're mefarish according to the chachamim. Okay, that's, I guess, I don't remember what answer we're up to. I think that was the 4th or the 5th. The next one, Rav Ashi me Aviria, I don't know where that place is, but it sounds, if I pronounce it right, Aviria. Rav Ashi from this place and said in the name of Rabbi Zera, Ki katanis dono karet. You know, the list of the Mishnah in Kritut, very, very notable for Kritut, are things that if you did them on purpose, you'd be chayiv karet. If you do them by mistake, you bring a karban chatat or asham, right? But zdono lav lo katani. But a shvuah is not an isur karet. If a person makes a shvuah, they're not going to eat, and they eat, they're not chayiv karet. They're over a lotase. So that, therefore, we didn't include this in the list. Ask me, what about the asham? This don't allow. What about the prohibition of the asham, which is the tuma, which is not a karet, the katani? Well, we mean the chatot kamina. The chatot of the Mishnah are davar shizdono karet. Okay, that's that answer. I think one more. You ready for one more, Nava? Ravina says one more answer. That the reason that we didn't include the top line of Daf Chaf Yamid Aleph, the reason we didn't include Shvua in the list of karbanot in the Mishnah in Kritut is because Kikatani midi dechayal amidi debar achila, right? Where am I? Who? That we're only referring to prohibitions that only apply to food, like the prohibition of nevela and tuma in the Beit HaMikdash and Yom Kippur, for example. But shvua dechayla midid la barachilahu lo katani. Shvua can be, you can make a shvua on anything. You don't have to make a shvua only on food. Remember, if you make a shvua specifically and say, I will not eat, or I will not do, or I will not think, or what, you can't make a shvua on thinking. I will not sleep, right? Things like that. That would be chal. Says more, but what about hektish? The chayil name eitzim v'avanim, right? Hektish is chayil on, you could give a hektish of non-food stuff. Ella, I sort of spoke this out a little bit early. Ki katani midi dechayil amidi itbe mashasha. What we mean is that most things in the Torah, in order for them to be effective, you have to have an object that has mashasha. Mashasha literally means substance, right? There has to be a tangible thing. But what Shvua is very unique, and if you've seen in the last 6 or 7 answers, they've talked about many of the uniquenesses of Shvua. But this is perhaps the most unique thing about Shvua, because Shvua is chayla amidi de let be mashasha. You can make a Shvua on something that is intangible. For example, kigon sheishan shelo ishan. Let's say I make a Shvua that I will not sleep tonight. How do you measure, right? You can't hold sleep. You can't quantify, meaning physically sleep. It is obviously something that happens. But since you can make a shvuah on things that have no essence, no mashasha, shvuah is clearly in a category very different than hektish, right? You can't say, I give my sleep to hektish, right? I think there are books like this, right? Where you give your sleep and you give your hours and your days. That doesn't exist, right? In real world, some of your fantasy books. Novella. Okay. But Shvua is a very unique kind of prohibition. And so basically, they're lokatani. And so basically what the Gemara has done is sort of opened you up to many of the nuances of Shvua. That clearly the Mishnah in Kritut says you're over for eating one thing for chataot. The truth is, according to everyone in our Gemara, the Mishnah could have added a 5th one. It could have said a Shvua that I won't eat this and potato chips, and it's chal on this also. Right? Mm-hmm. But the reason the Mishnah didn't is that Shvuot in many ways is a unique thing. Now, we said many reasons why. One is because it's chal on less than a shear. One is because it's chal on, I'm looking at all the answers we had, right? Where you don't chayiv karet for eating it. But this last one is because Shvua is chal even on intangible things, unlike all other prohibitions in the Mishnah, which are only chal on tangible things, and therefore it's not included in the list, even though it is true that you can make up a case where you'd be chayiv. And so that is basically a very, very succinct and fun daf for those who are awake. We'll stop here at the Mishnah. We'll pick it up tomorrow in more halachot of Shvuot at 7:45 a.m. Shavuot Tov again. Have a great day, everyone.
Chazaku Brug.
Thank
you.
Charlie.
Have a great day.
Take care. You too.